Okay, Jim, we've talked about organization, we've talked about budget, we've talked about resources, we've talked about major programs, and now we're going to talk about how the investments are actually governed and how the prioritizations are made by the program governance model itself.
Yeah. And this is probably one of the hardest parts, and one of the hardest parts to get right is that process piece of aligning resources with requirements and doing that prioritization. You know, and one of the things that at VA is there's the absence of any planning, programming, budgeting, execution process. There is no requirements oversight, so more and more falls down to OI&T in the line of business to directly connect and really arbitrate, if you will, up to those agency priority goals. So when we look here on this slide on the left-hand side, you've got the VA Executive Board, which is largely in name only. It's a C-suite board. It meets intermittently, but again, kind of activity-based in terms of the broader agenda, more focused on the larger programs. Beneath and nested under it is the VA Operations Board, and what where you see there is that is again tracking all of the major programs, but even some of the below the major program level efforts within VA, all the way from data governance and so on. You can see the Investment Review Council, and we'll tie that a little later on to the right-hand side, and the Investment Review Board process. That's something that was really finally started at VA about 18 months ago, and was completely absent, to be candid. Next slide. And here's that more detailed look at the right hand of that slide and the OIT governance framework. So you can see the IT Governance Board, which is chaired by the CIO, and what it does is it's looking at major programs over $15 million, but also policy decisions and things that float up from the council level. And Bill's going to get into more detail here in a minute on each of those individual councils you see highlighted in red. And speaking of red, you can see that the current organization by position, who chairs those or who co-chairs those. So I won't go over those in detail. I think Bill will touch on a little bit. But again, on the left-hand side, the real the real news is the Investment Review Board process. And what is that? OMB requires via Circular A130 that any CIO manage information as a strategic resource, and I can tell you that in a lot of departments that is not a common belief. It's really left to an ad hoc. In the worst manifestation, and I saw this at VA at some point, was managing by unfunded requirements, which is really the tail wagging the dog. It really is important up front to understand you have these prioritized requirements that get the funding. Anything that falls below the chalk line when you snap it is unfunded and is not capable of being enacted. Next slide. Bill, over to you to talk about the councils.
Thank you, Jim. Now we're going to talk about the Program and Acquisition Review Council and all the other subsequent councils as well. The PARC, or the Program and Acquisition Review Council, prioritizes the strategic oversight. So not only is it acquisition, but it's also in many ways helps bound the policies and the agenda items of the other councils. It's chaired by the PDAS, or the Deputy CIO, and co-chaired by Office of Strategic Sourcing, LaWanda Jones, as would make sense, and what makes sense because it has the funding and spending underneath it. Next chart. Now we're going to talk quickly about the Standards and Architecture Council. This governs all aspects of kind of the technical, not only the technical systems and the interfaces between them, but the policy guidelines, kind of the rule book about technology, how it gets implemented. What does our current what do our current architectures look like? Organizational, operational, technical system, and how do they interact with one another, and what should they look like tomorrow? So that's what the Standards and Architecture Council looks at. The next one is the Organization Workforce Council. We've talked a lot about the workforce today, and this council deals directly with the workforce issues. How many SESs should be in OIT? What are the needs, and how can we defend or represent those needs? What is our current organization? How should it be changed, if at all, to map what we're doing today operationally and what we're going to be doing tomorrow? What are the skills inventory in the OIT organization right now, and how should that change? So what does it mean for our industry partners is that this council really thinks through the skill set that we have and the skill set that we don't have, which then is a gap that can be filled by contractor support staff. So it's a very meaningful and relevant council, the decisions they make.
Well, think about it from a numbers perspective too. 8,000 people sounds like a lot, and there is some contractor support. By the way, if you're ever asked on OIT, what are the contractor numbers, you're changing the numerator. You need to also change it because the lines of business have contractors that have to be supported as well. So it's a moving variable. But the point is, I know the average in federal agencies is somewhere around 5%. So 8,000 doesn't sound like a lot of people, considering that 5% of 425,000 will be somewhere around 20,000 FTE positions. Again, technology is still a human-intensive enterprise in terms of deploying, servicing, enhancing, and decommissioning systems.
Exactly. It's high touch, as they say.
High touch.
The other thing, too, is that this council deals with a lot of the facilities. And, of course, the facilities, who are in the facilities, who need to be in the facilities, that's being affected in a major way by COVID right now.
Well, and I think, too, there's a lot of, there can be some misunderstanding about VA as, is it a technology organization? Probably in its highest aspiration would be. It's really technology enabled, and then even more importantly, you have a lot of the workforce, especially in healthcare, are great doctors, nurses, pharmacists, nutritionists, every clinical care, they're focused on serving patients, and we don't expect them to be technologists.
Right. Exactly right. The next council we're talking about is the Digital Transformation Council. This one's chaired by the Chief Technology Officer, as you can imagine. And this council focuses on what next, right? Where are we going? What are the opportunities for the next generation of technology? Maybe not the bleeding edge, maybe not neural networks, machine learning, AI yet, and things like that, 6G, 7G, but certainly opportunities like what is the next agile software development process that we should adopt here internally in our programs, in our policies for our own internal development. So it reaches out beyond where we are today and connects where we are today to where we're going to be 5-10 years from now.
Well, I think too, as the CTO, and I know you and I worked on in the role, and it's the responsibility remains too, is really understanding which emerging technologies provide the highest ROI, exactly. And then more importantly, what's going to be the cost for that. And that, again, that gets into the budget drill of if more and more increasingly is going to operations and maintenance and less for modernization and transformation, then there's a misalignment there.
Exactly. I'll tell you, for cloud, I had to make the choice about pulling money out of current development across the board and putting into standing up the cloud, and we got a major payback, I think, for that, probably a 10-to-1 return on investment. For every dollar we put in the cloud, we accrued $10 worth of legacy application data center support that was, frankly, better off being served by the cloud. But that's a choice that is increasingly being more difficult to make,
right?
Because there's less money available as it gets squeezed out by sustainment.
Well, and I always love when people talk about cloud and saving money, and as I tell folks, you're not going to save money, you're actually going to spend more because you're going to deliver better outcomes. Or as I say, the line of business within VA gets better outcomes, faster claims processing, better health outcomes, better memorial services, and OIT gets a bigger bill.
Yeah, amen. Okay, so finally, the last council we're going to talk about today is the COVID-19 IT Council. Obviously, we all hope that this council did not have to have been created, but it served a very important purpose of making sure that there were investments needed to deal with the COVID problems and issues and challenges, and then also the workforce. It was intended for this COVID-19 Council to be disbanded, hopefully this year. Who knows how long it will last, because I think there are still COVID workforce issues in front of us, but it probably will disband and expire at the end of this fiscal year, fingers crossed.
Well, let me just say too, Bill, before you move off COVID, what a great job Susan Perez and Paul Brubaker and the COVID team did, because there were two things. One, they made sure that all of that CARES money that went through COVID went through extreme governance. It was traceable. It was governed by appropriation and reviewed. And by the way, there were a lot of pre-existing unfunded requirements that had a COVID nexus that were able to be adjudicated. So wiped a bunch of technical debt off the books, had great traceability and governance, and then even more important, they made sure that any multi-year costs that were incurred were captured and identified for funding, so that we weren't creating additional unfunded requirements.
Right.
And that is often not the case in VA.
Yeah, very well put. So next we're going to move into the acquisition field. We've talked about budgets and resources and governance. Now we're down to how do these requirements and how does this money actually get spent and rewarded through contracts?
Sure. So I'll start us off on that and programs and contracts. So when we look at the acquisition structure at the agency and OIT levels, first off, this is obviously the agency top level slide. To the right, you can see the office of the Chief Acquisition Officer, otherwise known as the Office of Acquisition, Logistics and Construction, or OALC. And remember that VA spends in excess of $32 billion annually on outsourced spend. So as we'll talk about in the next slide, in the various categories, a lot of spending washing through. And speaking of that, we look at Mr. Mike Parrish, who is the Chief Acquisition Officer for the agency, Phil Christie as his deputy, Angela Billups as the Senior Procurement Executive, and Mike Brennan for Senior Facilities Management. And below them you have the three acquisition centers. We're going to focus on the Technology Acquisition Center on the next slide, but again, this gives you a good snapshot overall. Looking at the TAC, led by Michelle Foster, we know they're located in Eatontown, New Jersey. They are formerly the U.S. Army Acquisition Command, and prior to base realignment and closure, when that function was moved to Aberdeen, a lot of the staff, that talented staff there in Eatontown, stayed and was able to comprise what we now know as the TAC. You can see there's a number of service directors on here. They're available. I know, Bill, you're going to touch on it, and we know that Michelle and her team actually want industry partners to engage early and often throughout the process. We know there's some blackout periods. That'll be probably the subject of another webcast talking about Mythbusters and a lot of that, but early and often interaction with Michelle and her staff to make sure that outsourced spend, that you're responding appropriately and timely to RFIs, RFPs, and other contractual actions. Also, a footnote here is the TAC just released that it will conduct its annual planning brief to industry, APBI, on June 8th. We certainly are going to be a part of that at Federal Business, so stay tuned for a future announcement around that. And Bill, I know you're going to take us a little deeper in programs and contracts.
Sure. Thank you very much. These charts and this data comes from last year's APBI, and I strongly endorse and double stomp the idea that this is a very important conference to dial into. It's going to be virtual again this year. But it's a must attend for our industry partners. You can tell by this chart they're very busy. And I'm just going to take you right down to the bottom line there. Almost 3,000 contracts award per year come out of the TAC. And so as much as I encourage vendors to engage with the TAC, recognize that these folks are very, very busy and that respect their time and be very productive. The point I want to make about this chart are here are the top NAICS codes that are contracted out from the TAC. And the only point here, I mean, it's what you would expect, 541, 512, and so forth and so on, is take time to review your own NAICS in SAM.gov. All of the companies, you register in SAM.gov, you get a cage code, you get to put your NAICS codes in there. If you're interested in business with the TAC and specifically on some of the contracts we're going to be talking about, just do a double check to make sure your NAICS codes are aligned properly. This next chart is very, very interesting because it shows the numbers of contracts, new awards, that the TAC offers, at least from last year's data. And I don't expect it to change much this year. You can see the big, on the pie chart on the bottom, the big blue part, that's the NASA SOUP, Solutions for Enterprise-Wide Procurement, SCWP contract, and has many, many new awards, over 3 times the closest award contract category. And then it goes down through the BPAs, and then you can see the GSA contracts, followed by the T4NG. We're going to talk a little bit more about T4NG and the primes, but this is the large services contract that VA uses. And even though these numbers are right, they don't necessarily relate to value. So you might have a few very, very large contracts in one vehicle and a large number of smaller contracts on some of the other vehicles. But just what the message here is that if you're looking to do business with VA and you're not on one of these contract vehicles, at least this gives you an idea where to go for a subcontracting or a teaming partner arrangement. Here's the list of the current T4NG prime contract holders. There have been a lot of mergers and acquisition, and it's ongoing all the time. And so it's hard to keep track about who has privity of contract and what is the exact name of the vendor as it comes to the contract that gets signed with the VA. But this gives you the names of the primes and many of the companies that they've merged with, that were acquired by, or grew into. And for example, just take the second one on the list, Halfacre and Associates. They were acquired by SAIC, and obviously the portfolio of work that Halfacre had then accrues to SAIC. So again, the message here is if you're looking to work for the VA and offer some work, and you see some opportunities that are coming out that fits your capabilities, then you could be a differentiator to one of these primes if they choose to go after and bid on that work. This next chart are the awardees, the 9 SD small disabled veteran-owned small businesses that were awarded in the on-ramp for T4NG. This list, these awards are currently in litigation, and until a stay of performance is released by relieved by the court, these opportunities and these contractors will be on hold. But as soon as the court approves them and somehow relieves that protest action, then of course these folks will be open for business. I recommend that you start searching out these companies right now. In fact, all of the companies. If you're in the VA market, you need to know the points of contact, and you need to have differentiators and solutions that can help them win that business.
Bill, we have a number of commercial entities that start federal business, federal sector businesses, and they don't understand the whole nature of SDVOSB, set-asides, the rule of two. Do you want to, for those that are kind of new entrants or newer entrants, do you want to talk about the criticality of that?
Sure. So when, and it's relevant to the next chart as well. So when a requirement gets acquired by VA, say it's coming out from the TAC on the T4NG contract vehicle. Well, in VA, the first thing you have to say, are there 2 or more service-disabled or veteran-owned small businesses who reasonably could handle or service that requirement? If so, then the TAC will set that aside for a service-disabled veteran-owned SDVOSB competition. And so it's important to pay attention to the RFIs and to respond to those RFIs, especially if you're an SDVOSB, in order to bid out your capabilities to service that requirement.
Yep. Great.
We're going to go through a few more of the larger programs and contracts right now. For example, the National Local Exchange Carrier. This is your local telephone type of connectivity. And the one below that, the Enterprise-Wide Cloud Capacity and Services. There have been some RFIs out on this one, and you can see why. You look at the bottom line there. It expires, the contract expires in September 2022, so they're getting ready for a new solicitation there.
You know, it's interesting. While a lot of people think that with the big EIS contract, which you're going to touch on here in a minute, that everything's done by, with, and through the major carriers, they really don't understand that whole notion of the local exchange carrier. And I can think of more than a few conversations I've had to have with CEOs of Lex to make sure that service quality and service level agreements were being met.
Mm-hmm. Now we're going to talk about Cedar. That's a large ceiling contract for customer experience, DevOps, and Agile releases, primarily Agile support. This contract was sponsored primarily through the Chief Technology Office, and it's set aside for service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. You can see the awards that were made there. Interestingly, every one of the awardees are members of an organization called the Digital Services Coalition. Not a lot of people knew that or recognized that. It is a multiple award contract, and it really will help advance the ball as it comes to DevOps activities inside the DevSecOps organization at OIT. This next contract vector, $25 billion ceiling, veteran enterprise contracting for transformation and operational readiness, 100% SDVOSB, many awards, over 100 awards, 6 service groups, has lots of different capability, lots of great labor categories. But the neat thing about this contract is that since every one of the companies are service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, there is no need to issue an RFI to see if a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business can handle the requirement. So they can go directly from the requirement to a solicitation and not have to touch on the RFI step for that rule of 2. Now, they may still issue an RFI for market research purposes, which is fine, but the rule of two need is mitigated through this vehicle.
Interesting. Yeah.
The other interesting thing, too, is released by the SAC up in Fredericksburg, Maryland, Frederick, Maryland, as opposed to the TAC in Eatontown.
Yep.
And finally, the large EIS contract. This is a GSA contract. You can see the vendors there and the standard telecom services. This is a major contract that allows the organizations, VA is no different than all the federal agencies, to modernize their network. All federal agencies are required to get off the previous contract, which was Networks with an X, and move to EIS. And they're required to do that by September 2022 in terms of disconnecting, and then have, because the network's contract, it expires in 2023. VA uses EIS extensively, and when last June awarded a major contract to AT&T for $725 million. So it's a great vehicle, and VA uses it extensively and does a great job at upgrading its capabilities in the WAN and broad area network technology area.
Thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you very much, everybody.